There are moments in war when the lines between enemy and human blur so completely that everything we think we know about conflict shatters like glass under a boot. On the morning of June 28, 2005, in the Kush province of northeastern Afghanistan, high in the mountains where even eagles struggle for breath, a young American Navy SEAL named Marcus Luttrell lay dying in a ravine. He'd been shot multiple times, his bones were broken, and his 3 teammates were dead. Above him, on the ridge, Taliban fighters moved through the rocks searching for survivors to execute. And then a man appeared. Not an American, not a rescuer, but a Taliban fighter who would make a choice that defied every rule of the war being fought around them. His name was Muhammad Ghalib, and what he did next would prove that even in the darkest corners of human conflict, there exists something stronger than hatred, something older than war itself. The Hindu Kush mountains are not forgiving terrain. They rise like the teeth of some ancient god, jagged and cruel, peaks touching 12,000 feet, where the air is thin enough to make every breath a labor and every step a calculated risk. The locals, the Pashtun tribes who have lived in these mountains for centuries, know every goat path, every hidden spring, every cave that offers shelter from the killing heat of summer or the brutal cold of winter. They are people carved from the same stone as their mountains, hard, resilient, bound by codes of honor that predate Islam itself, codes that govern everything from hospitality to revenge, from marriage to warfare. Into these mountains came Operation Red Wings, a reconnaissance and surveillance mission targeting a high-value Taliban commander named Ahmad Shah. The 4-man SEAL team, Marcus Luttrell, Michael Murphy, Danny Dietz, and Matthew Axelson, inserted by helicopter in the pre-dawn darkness of June 27, 2005. They were some of America's most elite warriors, trained to operate in small teams behind enemy lines, to gather intelligence, to kill when necessary, and to survive in conditions that would break ordinary men. They carried advanced communications equipment, precision rifles, night vision optics, and enough ammunition to fight their way out of most situations. What they didn't carry was enough understanding of the terrain, the culture, or the enemy they were about to face. The mission went wrong almost immediately. The SEALs established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley where Ahmad Shah was believed to be operating, but within hours they were compromised. 3 Afghan goat herders, an old man and 2 teenagers, stumbled directly into their position. It was the kind of tactical nightmare that keeps special operations commanders awake at night. The herders were unarmed civilians, protected under the rules of engagement. But if released, they would certainly inform the Taliban of the Americans' location. The team faced an impossible choice: execute unarmed prisoners in violation of every law and moral code they'd sworn to uphold, or let them go and face almost certain death. They let them go. Michael Murphy, the team leader, made the call. He was 29 years old, from Patchogue, New York, a former lifeguard who joined the Navy to serve his country after September 11th. He believed in doing the right thing even when it cost everything. The 3 Afghans were released and told to leave. The SEALs knew they had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, before the entire Taliban network in the region descended on them. They immediately broke position and began moving toward a safer location where they could call for extraction. They didn't get far. Within 90 minutes, the mountains erupted with gunfire. Taliban fighters, anywhere from 30 to over 100, depending on whose account you believe, attacked from multiple directions. These weren't the untrained farmers with rusty AK-47s that American forces sometimes encountered. These were experienced fighters, many of them veterans of decades of war, first against the Soviets, then in the Afghan Civil War, now against the Americans. They knew the terrain intimately. They knew how to move through the rocks without being seen, how to use the high ground, how to coordinate their fire to maximum effect. The 4 SEALs fought with everything they had. They fell back down the mountain, taking cover behind rocks, returning fire, trying to create enough distance to call for help. But the terrain worked against them. The steep slopes meant that every retreat was a controlled fall, tumbling down rock faces, slamming into boulders, bones cracking, equipment shattering. And still they fought. Danny Dietz, a 25-year-old from Littleton, Colorado, was hit multiple times but kept firing, covering his teammates until a round finally killed him. Matthew Axelson, 29, from Cupertino, California, fought even as his body accumulated wound after wound, refusing to quit until he physically couldn't continue. Michael Murphy made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously. With their communications equipment damaged by gunfire and the mountains blocking their satellite signal, he couldn't call for help from cover. So he walked out into the open, fully exposed to enemy fire, and made the call that would bring rescue helicopters. He was shot multiple times while transmitting their position, but he finished the call before he died. His last words were, "Thank you," to the operations center before Taliban rounds ended his life. Marcus Luttrell, the only one still alive, tumbled down the mountain in a desperate attempt to escape. He fell hundreds of feet, breaking bones, tearing muscles, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. He landed in a ravine, half-conscious, barely able to move. Above him, he could hear the Taliban fighters celebrating their victory, searching the rocks for bodies and survivors. He tried to crawl deeper into the rocks, to hide, to survive just a little longer. His body was shutting down from blood loss and trauma. His mind was fragmenting from pain and shock. He knew he was going to die in these mountains, thousands of miles from home, his body left to rot in a foreign land. That's when Muhammad Ghalib found him. Ghalib was not a soldier in any formal sense. He was a Pashtun villager from Sabri, a small settlement of stone houses clinging to the mountainside. He was in his mid-30s, married with children, a man who made his living from the land and from his goats. But he was also a man shaped by decades of war. He'd fought against the Soviets in the 1980s as a teenager. He'd survived the chaos of the Civil War in the 1990s. He knew what the Taliban were, what they believed, what they did to people who opposed them. And he knew the ancient Pashtun code called Pashtunwali, a code of conduct that had governed his people for thousands of years, a code that placed certain obligations above all others, even above politics, even above religion, even above life itself. One of the central tenets of Pashtunwali is called Nanawatai, the obligation to provide sanctuary to anyone who asks for it, even your enemy, especially your enemy. It is an absolute obligation, one that cannot be refused without bringing eternal shame upon yourself and your family. When Ghalib found Luttrell in that ravine, broken and bleeding and minutes from death, he saw not an American soldier, not an infidel, not an enemy. He saw a man who needed help. And according to the code he lived by, that was enough. Ghalib made a decision that would put his entire family at risk. He gave Luttrell water from his own canteen. He applied pressure to the worst wounds to slow the bleeding. He helped the American to his feet and began the agonizing journey back to his village. Luttrell was delirious from blood loss, barely conscious, unable to walk without support. Ghalib essentially carried him through the mountains, moving carefully to avoid Taliban patrols that were still searching for survivors. It took hours. Every step was agony for Luttrell. Every minute increased the risk that Ghalib would be discovered helping the enemy. They reached Sabri as the sun was setting. Ghalib brought Luttrell to his own home, laid him on a bed, and began treating his wounds as best he could with the limited medical supplies available. He gave him food and water. He posted guards to watch for Taliban. And then he called a council of the village elders to explain what he had done and to invoke Nanawatai on behalf of the American. The meeting was tense. Sabri was a small village, perhaps 50 families, poor even by Afghan standards, isolated and vulnerable. The Taliban had power in this region. If they discovered that the village was harboring an American soldier, the retribution would be terrible. The village could be destroyed, the men killed, the women and children driven into the mountains to starve. Some of the elders argued that Ghalib should turn the American over to the Taliban, that his obligation to protect his own people superseded any ancient code about sanctuary. But Ghalib argued back with the passion of a man who knew what was at stake. He invoked Pashtunwali, the code that defined them as Pashtun, the code that separated them from barbarism, the code that had allowed their culture to survive centuries of invasion and war. To violate Nanawatai, he argued, was to cease being Pashtun. It was to become something less than human. He had given his word that this man would be protected. His honor, and by extension the honor of the entire village, depended on keeping that word. The elders voted. It was not unanimous, but the majority supported Ghalib. They would protect the American. They would face whatever consequences came. The consequences came quickly. Within 24 hours, Taliban fighters arrived in Sabri demanding that the American be turned over. They threatened the villagers, promised death and destruction if their demands weren't met. The village elders refused. Armed men from Sabri, including Ghalib, formed a defensive perimeter around the house where Luttrell was recovering. For 3 days, the village existed in a state of siege, Taliban fighters surrounding them, threatening them, occasionally firing shots to intimidate them. Inside the house, Luttrell drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infection and shock, unaware of the battle being fought to protect him. Ghalib barely slept during those 3 days. He stayed close to Luttrell, changing his bandages, making sure he drank water and ate what little he could keep down. Through gestures and the few words of Pashto that Luttrell remembered from his training, they communicated. Ghalib explained that he was safe, that he was being protected, that help would come. Luttrell asked why. Why would this man risk everything for an enemy? Ghalib's answer was simple, translated through hand gestures and broken phrases. Because you are a guest in my home. Meanwhile, Michael Murphy's desperate phone call had triggered a massive rescue operation. American Special Operations Forces were searching the mountains, following leads, questioning locals, trying to find their missing SEAL. The Taliban knew this and increased their pressure on Sabri. They brought more fighters, heavier weapons. They told the villagers that when the Americans came, there would be a battle, and Sabri would be caught in the middle, destroyed by crossfire, if not by Taliban revenge. The elders held firm. They sent a runner to find American forces and guide them to the village. It was an incredibly dangerous mission. The runner had to cross Taliban-controlled territory, avoid checkpoints and patrols, and somehow make contact with American troops without being shot as a potential suicide bomber or ambusher. But the runner succeeded. On the 4th day after Ghalib found Luttrell, American helicopters appeared over the mountains. The extraction was tense. The helicopters landed in a storm of dust and rotor wash, heavily armed soldiers pouring out, establishing a perimeter, weapons trained on every window and doorway. Ghalib carried Luttrell out of the house, supporting his weight, moving slowly to show he was not a threat. American soldiers rushed forward, taking Luttrell, laying him on a stretcher, beginning emergency medical treatment. Ghalib stepped back, his job complete, prepared to return to his village and face whatever came next. But Luttrell wouldn't let him go. Even through his pain and exhaustion, even barely conscious, he grabbed Ghalib's arm and held on. He told the soldiers to protect this man, to take him with them, that he had saved his life. The American commander made a quick decision. Ghalib and several members of his family were evacuated along with Luttrell. As the helicopters lifted off, Ghalib looked down at his village, the only home he'd ever known, and wondered if he would ever see it again. The aftermath was complicated in ways that Hollywood endings never capture. Luttrell survived his wounds and eventually returned to the United States, though he would carry the physical and psychological scars of Operation Red Wings for the rest of his life. He wrote a book about his experience called Lone Survivor, which became a bestseller and was eventually made into a major motion picture. He never forgot Muhammad Ghalib. He advocated for him, tried to help him, tried to repay the debt he owed. But Ghalib's life became infinitely harder. The Taliban marked him as a traitor. They attacked his village multiple times in revenge for protecting an American. His house was destroyed. His family was threatened. He couldn't farm his land or tend his goats because Taliban fighters were actively hunting him. The Afghan government, weak and corrupt, offered little protection. Ghalib tried to get asylum in the United States, but the bureaucratic process was nightmarish. Years of applications and interviews and background checks while he lived in hiding, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for his enemies to find him. He eventually made it to America, but it wasn't the happy ending that movies promise. He arrived as a refugee with no money, no job skills that translated to American life, unable to speak English beyond a few basic phrases. The media attention from Lone Survivor had made him famous, but also made his situation more dangerous. Taliban sympathizers, even in America, knew who he was. He received death threats. He lived in constant fear not for himself, but for his family who were still in Afghanistan, vulnerable to retaliation. Luttrell did what he could. He helped Ghalib financially when possible, advocated for his family to be brought to safety, spoke publicly about the debt he owed. But the systems of immigration and refugee resettlement are slow and impersonal, grinding up individual stories in bureaucratic machinery. Ghalab's family waited years to be reunited. His children grew up in a war zone. His wife lived in fear. The price he paid for following Pashtunwali was higher than anyone should have to pay. And yet, when interviewed, when asked if he regretted his decision, Ghalab's answer was always the same. He had done what was required. He had honored his code. He had saved a human life. He would make the same choice again. This is where the story transcends simple narrative and becomes something more profound, a meditation on what it means to be human in the midst of inhumanity. Muhammad Ghalab was not a pacifist. He had fought in wars. He understood violence. He probably would have fought against American forces under different circumstances. But when he found Marcus Luttrell broken and dying in that ravine, he didn't see an enemy combatant or a political symbol or a target. He saw a human being in desperate need, and an ancient code told him what he had to do. The process was nightmarish. Years of applications and interviews and background checks while he lived in hiding, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for his enemies to find him. He eventually made it to America, but it wasn't the happy ending that movies promise. He arrived as a refugee with no money, no job skills that translated to American life, unable to speak English beyond a few basic phrases. The media attention from Lone Survivor had made him famous, but also made his situation more dangerous. Taliban sympathizers, even in America, knew who he was. He received death threats. He lived in constant fear not for himself, but for his family who were still in Afghanistan, vulnerable to retaliation. Luttrell did what he could. He helped Ghalab financially when possible, advocated for his family to be brought to safety, spoke publicly about the debt he owed. But the systems of immigration and refugee resettlement are slow and impersonal, grinding up individual stories in bureaucratic machinery. Ghalab's family waited years to be reunited. His children grew up in a war zone. His wife lived in fear. The price he paid for following Pashtunwali was higher than anyone should have to pay. And yet, when interviewed, when asked if he regretted his decision, Ghalab's answer was always the same. He had done what was required. He had honored his code. He had saved a human life. He would make the same choice again. This is where the story transcends simple narrative and becomes something more profound, a meditation on what it means to be human in the midst of inhumanity. Muhammad Ghalab was not a pacifist. He had fought in wars. He understood violence. He probably would have fought against American forces under different circumstances. But when he found Marcus Luttrell broken and dying in that ravine, he didn't see an enemy combatant or a political symbol or a target. He saw a human being in desperate need, and an ancient code told him what he had to do. The process was nightmarish. Years of applications and interviews and background checks while he lived in hiding, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for his enemies to find him. He eventually made it to America, but it wasn't the happy ending that movies promise. He arrived as a refugee with no money, no job skills that translated to American life, unable to speak English beyond a few basic phrases. The media attention from Lone Survivor had made him famous, but also made his situation more dangerous. Taliban sympathizers, even in America, knew who he was. He received death threats. He lived in constant fear not for himself, but for his family who were still in Afghanistan, vulnerable to retaliation. Luttrell did what he could. He helped Ghalab financially when possible, advocated for his family to be brought to safety, spoke publicly about the debt he owed. But the systems of immigration and refugee resettlement are slow and impersonal, grinding up individual stories in bureaucratic machinery. Ghalab's family waited years to be reunited. His children grew up in a war zone. His wife lived in fear. The price he paid for following Pashtunwali was higher than anyone should have to pay. And yet, when interviewed, when asked if he regretted his decision, Ghalab's answer was always the same. He had done what was required. He had honored his code. He had saved a human life. He would make the same choice again. This is where the story transcends simple narrative and becomes something more profound, a meditation on what it means to be human in the midst of inhumanity. Muhammad Ghalab was not a pacifist. He had fought in wars. He understood violence. He probably would have fought against American forces under different circumstances. But when he found Marcus Luttrell broken and dying in that ravine, he didn't see an enemy combatant or a political symbol or a target. He saw a human being in desperate need, and an ancient code told him what he had to do. The easy analysis would be to romanticize this, to turn it into a simple story about how humanity triumphs over war, how goodness exists even in the darkest places. But the truth is more complex and more tragic. Ghalab's choice cost him nearly everything. His village suffered. His family was torn apart. His life was uprooted. The Taliban's revenge was real and ongoing. The American bureaucracy that should have protected him instead entangled him in red tape. The story doesn't have a clean ending because real life doesn't have clean endings. What it does have is a moment. A single decision point in a ravine in the Hindu Kush mountains where one man chose compassion over pragmatism, honor over safety, humanity over tribalism. It's a moment that challenges every easy narrative about the war on terror, about clash of civilizations, about irreconcilable differences between cultures. Because in that moment, an Afghan villager and an American soldier connected across every barrier that should have made connection impossible. The broader context makes this even more remarkable. By 2005, the war in Afghanistan had already been going on for nearly 4 years. The initial optimism after the Taliban's fall had given way to grinding insurgency. The Guantanamo Bay detention facility was holding hundreds of prisoners in legal limbo. Reports of torture and abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq had damaged America's moral standing. Drone strikes were killing civilians along with militants. The Taliban were telling villagers that Americans were infidels who hated Islam and wanted to destroy their way of life. And in many ways, the American military presence was doing exactly that, disrupting traditional power structures, imposing foreign values, killing people in night raids and airstrikes. Into this context of mutual suspicion and violence came Ghalab's decision. It wasn't naive. He knew what Americans had done in his country. He knew about the night raids that killed civilians, the airstrikes that destroyed villages, the detention facilities where men disappeared. He had every reason to let Luttrell die or to turn him over to the Taliban. Instead, he invoked a code older than the conflict, older than nations, older than religions. The simple idea that you help someone who needs help. The American military's response is also worth noting. When they came to extract Luttrell, they were entering a village that could have been an elaborate ambush. They had every tactical reason to be suspicious, to treat every Afghan as a potential threat. Standard operating procedure in many cases would have been to secure the area with overwhelming force, detain all military-age males for questioning, search every building. Instead, when they understood what Ghalab had done, they treated him as an ally. They evacuated him and his family. They recognized that this man had risked everything to save one of their own, and they honored that. It's a small moment of humanity on both sides in a war that had precious few such moments. And it's a moment that both sides have struggled to build on. The war in Afghanistan would continue for another 16 years after Ghalab saved Luttrell. Tens of thousands more would die. The Taliban would eventually return to power. The promises made to allies and interpreters who helped American forces would be broken more often than kept. The American withdrawal in 2021 would abandon many of those who had shown courage and compassion similar to Ghalab's. But the moment still matters. It matters because it proves something essential about human nature, that we are not doomed to be prisoners of our worst impulses. That codes of honor and compassion can still function even when everything else is broken down. That individual choices matter even when they seem futile against the vast machinery of war and politics. Marcus Luttrell lives with survivor's guilt, the knowledge that 3 better men than him, as he describes them, died on that mountain while he lived. He carries their memory with him every day. He named his son after Michael Murphy. He speaks at military events and veterans gatherings, telling the story of Operation Red Wings, making sure his teammates are remembered as heroes. And he tells the story of Muhammad Ghalab, making sure people understand that he's alive today because an enemy chose to be human. Ghalab lives with his own burdens. He lost his home, his livelihood, his sense of place in the world. Others see it as an example of universal human decency that transcends religion. Some see it as a tragedy, a good man punished for doing good in a world that rewards cruelty. Others see it as hope, evidence that even in the worst circumstances, humans can choose compassion. All of these interpretations have some truth. None of them fully capture the complexity of what happened. What's certain is this. On June 28, 2005, in the mountains of Afghanistan, two men from radically different worlds met under the worst possible circumstances. One was dying. One had the power to let him die or help him live. Everything in their world told them they were enemies. Everything in their history suggested that mercy was weakness. Everything in their circumstances made compassion dangerous. And yet Muhammad Ghalib helped Marcus Luttrell anyway. Not because it was easy or safe or profitable, but because an ancient code told him it was right. And in that moment, in that choice, he proved that we are more than our wars, more than our politics, more than our fears and hatreds. We are, when we choose to be, simply human, capable of seeing another human in pain and choosing to ease that pain regardless of the cost. The sun sets on those mountains every evening, casting long shadows across the valleys, painting the peaks in gold and purple before darkness claims them. The war goes on in different forms, with different actors, but always the same suffering. And somewhere in America, a former Navy SEAL carries the weight of brotherhood and debt and survival. And somewhere else in America, an Afghan refugee carries the weight of exile and loss and honor kept. Two men bound together by a moment of humanity in the midst of inhumanity, living proof that even in our darkest chapters, we can choose to write verses of light.